Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott, the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we'll be talking about IFR safety and some of the many things your CFII might not have taught you for the instrument rating. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, in whatever app you're listening to now, take a moment now and touch the subscribe or the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Last week in episode 248, we talked with Kate Quinn, Executive Director of Pilots and Paws, about how GA pilots can help with their mission of saving pets from being euthanized. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/248. And this is a listener-supported show. We're still ad-free. So think about what it might be worth to you if you were to learn just one thing that could someday save your life. And then sign up to join us. Become a member. Support the show financially at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the air. Now, this is going to be a shorter show than usual because I've had a busy flight schedule, and I'm just about to hop onto a commercial flight to go to Knoxville, Tennessee, to visit Cirrus, where I'll be doing several days of annual recurrent training for the SF-50 Vision Jet. So for any type rating, you have to do recurrent training every year, otherwise you're no longer qualified to fly in that jet. Now the good news is this also substitutes for a flight review, so you don't have to do that to BFR every 2 years if you're doing jet type rating recurrent training. Let me tell you briefly about what we'll be doing in that. There will be a couple of days of rides in the simulator, and then my check ride, which is on Monday, will actually be in the airplane. Typically, they do that in the simulator, but I think that they're just getting busy and they needed to have more ways to give check rides on the same day. For the actual check ride itself, it will start with an oral discussion talking about systems, things like the electrical system, the environmental control system, bleed air system, fuel system, landing gear system. There are a lot of memory items for emergency procedures that need to be memorized. And then after that, we're going to go out to the airplane and we will do some of the same maneuvers that you would do in just about any airplane on a check ride. So we'll be doing steep turns, we'll be doing slow flight, we'll be doing a couple of different kinds of stalls, we'll be doing unusual attitudes, and then we'll fly 4 different instrument approaches. And there's going to be a requirement, I think, that at least one is hand-flown, at least one is coupled to the autopilot, and I just don't recall what the others are off the top of my head. But for sure, it will also include one or more emergencies as well. So, for example, we might simulate an engine fire, or might simulate a landing gear failure, or something like that. So that's what's going to be going on. And this week's topic is particularly appropriate for that, because these tips that I'm just about to pass along to you are things that I've observed when teaching people in the Vision Jet. And of course, they also apply to flying in just about any other aircraft as well, whether it's a piston or a jet. So here we go. And now let's talk about flying IFRs safely and about some of the things your CFII might not have taught you. Many of these tips will help you fly IFR more professionally, meaning that you're ahead of the airplane, you're doing the many small tasks that need to be done, and you're not needing much prompting and correction from ATC. Most of the things I'll talk about today are things I've observed pilots do incorrectly just in the last few weeks. Many of these were in a Vision Jet with pilots transitioning into the plane, and 2 of the items were mistakes that I've made. If you're not instrument rated and you're thinking about getting an instrument rating, I strongly encourage you to do it. Getting an instrument rating improves your overall flying skills and should enhance your safety. But flying in instrument conditions and overlooking some of the things we'll talk about are going to add to your risk. Now, like many things in life, preparation and practice of IFR flying are very important. If you want to be a good comedian, well, you must prepare and practice. Want to be a good instrument pilot? Same thing. You need to prepare before a flight, and you need to fly in the system to practice and improve upon the skills you've learned getting your instrument rating. Because there's a lot you'll learn after you get your rating, and we'll talk about many of those things today. A lot of pilots understand the basics of flying instrument approaches and focus on just the approaches themselves, but they lack experience with other important aspects, so they are unknowingly taking on greater risk. And a lot of this is about professionalism. If you're getting prompted from ATC to help get you through some of this, you're just not doing it as well as you should be. I see a lot of these problem areas as pilots transition to jets. They can get through flying an instrument approach into a non-busy airport, but they're unequipped to fly arrivals, departure procedures, and approaches into a major airport. I'll organize these items roughly from the beginning of a flight through the end of the flight. Some of these are major items that could cause big problems, and others are just minor oversights. But collectively, if you're overlooking a number of these, you're just not flying as professionally as you could be. Now, this first one is minor. I see many pilots at towered airports planning to call on the ground frequency to ask for their IFR clearance without first checking to see if there's a separate clearance delivery frequency at the airport. If you make this mistake and call ground first, they will just send you over to the clearance delivery frequency, but you just wasted a little bit of their time and yours. A bigger mistake, which is common among both jet and piston pilots, is the failure to enter everything from your clearance into the aircraft. For example, people sometimes forget to enter the departure frequency or the transponder code. Years ago, someone suggested to me that I review my clearance and put a check mark next to each item after I enter it into an aircraft system. That's what I do every time I fly, and it's the way I frequently catch when a pilot has failed to enter something. Pilots should also review their entire flight plan before departure. Occasionally, I'll find that a pilot has forgotten to load a departure procedure or is missing something toward the end of the flight plan. If you're flying a modern glass cockpit aircraft that lets you upload flight plans from ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot, I'd encourage you to use that capability, as you're less likely to have mistakes in the aircraft's flight plan. And if you ever pick up a clearance in the air, don't accept a frequency change if you still have questions about the clearance. A year ago, I was flying an instrument approach with a pilot into San Luis Obispo, and we flew the missed approach. We were given our IFR clearance to Van Nuys, but we didn't understand one aspect of the clearance, and I tried to stop the pilot from accepting a frequency change, but he did it anyway. We then queried the next controller about the clearance, and he was rightfully a little flabbergasted that we were in the air, in a jet, with a clearance that we didn't understand, and he asked us how that happened. Well, the clearance that confused us was a tech route, that's TEC. Now, we never get those in Northern California, but they're used quite often in Southern California. If you're unfamiliar with tech routes, tech stands for Tower and Route Control, and these are predetermined routes between pairs of airports that are so close to each other that you won't be handed off to a center. Instead, you'll stay within an approach control area, such as SoCal Approach. And these tech routes have funky little names. For example, there are two tech routes from San Luis Obispo to Van Nuys, the Santa Barbara P37 and the Santa Barbara P38. I'll try entering that into your aircraft's GPS or FMS system. In some cases, you can. In other cases, you'll need to find the individual waypoints that define the tech route. For example, the Santa Barbara P38 is defined as the San Marcos VOR, which inexplicably has RZS as its identifier, Victor 186, Fillmore VOR, and the Fernando arrival. And where do you find the definition of these routes? Well, in the bad old days, when people carried paper charts, they were easy to find in the back of the chart book. If you're using ForeFlight, you'll need to go to Documents, the FAA folder, Chart Supplemental AFD, and finally Tower and Route Control Routes. And you'll need to have downloaded that before you leave the ground, unless you have an internet connection in the air. So if you plan to someday fly to Southern California and you haven't already set up your EFB to automatically download the 11 chart supplemental AFDs, do it now. As you can see, it's going to be a little tough to try and find them on the fly unless you've practiced looking for them ahead of time. Now, I frequently see people set the altitude selector incorrectly on the ground when their clearance is to climb via on a departure procedure. Climb via means to climb to the altitudes listed for each fix on the procedure, but pilots often set the altitude selector to the first altitude on the procedure, which will cause the aircraft to level off at that altitude, which is not what you want. You want the aircraft to be at that altitude at the first fix, and you want it to continue to climb through that altitude to all of the subsequent fix altitudes. Speaking of departure procedures, a pet peeve of mine is when a pilot loads a departure procedure and then they do nothing else. But they expect the plane to just fly the departure procedure correctly. Now, if you remember nothing else from today, remember this. If you get a departure procedure, you need to review the departure procedure chart before you depart. Now think about it for a moment. Would you ever load an unfamiliar instrument approach and not look at the approach chart before you flew it? No, of course not. Now, in particular, you need to look for non-standard climb rates. The entire IFR system is predicated upon your aircraft always being able to climb at least 200 feet per nautical mile. But many departure procedures require even higher climb rates. And sadly, after I've sometimes prompted a pilot to read a departure chart and discover that there is a non-standard climb rate, many of them don't bother to pull out the POH. You'll want to look at the POH to see if your aircraft can meet the higher required feet per nautical mile climb rate under different conditions, which might vary with aircraft weight, flap settings, whether you're climbing and icing, and so on. You also need to check departure procedure charts for any required speeds on the chart to verify that you can meet those speeds as you climb. Departure procedure charts often list the tower and departure frequencies to be used for the runway you'll be departing on. So if your clearance didn't include a departure frequency, look for it on the departure chart. Also, if your clearance doesn't include an altitude and you've been cleared to climb via a departure procedure, look at the departure procedure chart to find the top altitude you're cleared to. On the FAA charts, that altitude is listed at the top of the departure procedure charts. Once you're in flight, ATC might give you a shortcut by clearing you to a new fix. Often I'm with pilots who are unfamiliar with a new fix, and they may query ATC about it and ask for a spelling. And as you're asking about that strange fix, ATC may be thinking, what a goober you are, because that fix is almost always in your flight plan. And here's an almost foolproof way for determining if that strange new fix is in your flight plan. If ATC doesn't first say, I have an amendment to your clearance, advise when ready to copy, they aren't changing your clearance, so that strange new fix is almost certainly already in your current clearance and hence in your flight plan. Often the fix you're cleared to is the fix at which they want you to join the arrival procedure, though it might not be the first fix on the arrival. It might be somewhere further along on the arrival. So be familiar with your flight plan and waypoints along any arrival procedures you've been assigned. Be professional. Then, if possible, keep your flight plan open in flight, so when you're cleared to a new fix, you can rapidly scroll through the flight plan to find that strange new fix as you read it back to the controller. And of course, sometimes ATC will give us a new fix that's not in our clearance. And yes, you should ask how to spell any fix or VOR with which you're unfamiliar. But almost always when ATC gives you a new fix that's not in your clearance, they will preface it with something like, I have an amendment to your clearance, advise when ready to copy. Also, you need to know how to put in crossing altitudes. For example, if ATC says to cross 10 miles north of Fern at 15,000 feet, know how to put that into your system. And if you're using the G1000, G3000, 5000, or Perspective, you are going to be using the along track offset feature. Read about it in my books, which you can find at maxtruscott.com. Just look along the right side of the webpage for links to order any of those books. Also, while on cruise, you should be thinking about any arrival procedure you've been assigned. Many arrivals split into two separate branches as you near the airport, with each branch taking you to a separate set of runways. So while in flight, you should check the ATIS for your destination to see which runway you'll likely be using. Then update the arrival procedure in your flight plan to reflect the current runway being used. But also look for hints that you may receive from ATC that something has changed. Several years ago, I was flying into Salt Lake City in a Vision jet when Salt Lake Center came on frequency and simply said, Salt Lake City is landing north. Now my P-brain didn't register that I needed to go into my flight plan and update the arrival with a new runway so that I would end up on the branch of the arrival that led to the north runways, which are 34 left and right and runway 35. Much later in the flight, as we were getting close to the airport, Salt Lake Approach said that it appeared that we were about 1.5 miles off course, to which I replied, no, we're on the arrival. But of course, I was on the wrong branch of the arrival since I didn't update the arrival when I was told that Salt Lake City was landing north. Lesson learned. Just as some pilots don't read departure procedure charts, some pilots also don't look at arrival charts. You really need to look at them in advance. For example, there may be speed restrictions on the arrival where you have to maintain a certain airspeed as you cross a particular fix. If you're unable to meet a speed restriction, you should advise ATC well in advance. That way they'll either waive the speed restriction or they may put you on a different arrival that doesn't have any speed restrictions. You should also look at your arrival procedures to see whether there are any expected altitudes at any of the fixes. These are often marked with a line under the altitude, indicating that you need to be at or above that altitude as you cross the fix, or they might be marked with two lines, one above and one below the altitude, indicating that you need to cross the fix at exactly that altitude. When you see expected altitudes like these, you might be given a descend via clearance, in which you make all of the descents yourself as you follow the step-downs on the arrival. But don't confuse these altitudes with altitudes that are not at the fixes, but are next to the line segments joining each of the fixes. Those are minimum altitudes for each segment, and not altitudes to follow if given a descend via clearance. And if you have been cleared to descend via, when you switch to the next controller, it's a good idea to check in by saying that you're descending via, just to confirm to the controller your current instruction that was issued by the prior controller. Now, here's a little goof that I made a week ago while flying into Bakersfield. We were flying at flight level 310 when we were told to descend at pilot's discretion to 16,000 feet. To help us figure out when we might want to start descending, I referred to the moving map to see where the TOD, or top of descent point, was located. Normally, that would be about the optimal time to start your descent, and in a jet, you'd like to stay as high as possible, as long as possible, since you burn much less fuel at higher altitudes. Well, a number of minutes later, just as we were reaching the TOD on the map and were about to start our descent from flight level 310, the controller asked, "What airport are you landing at?" implying that we were now way above where a jet would typically be if it were landing at Bakersfield. We immediately started to descend, which is what we were about to do anyway, and I started to look at how the TOD was being calculated to see why it had led us astray and kept us up so high for so long. What I discovered was that our flight plan was correct. It was taking us to the Shafter VOR about 4 miles north of the field, and then to the Bakersfield airport. But since we had loaded the visual approach for runway 12 left, it then showed a path going back north again to start the visual approach. And had we been planning to fly south to the airport and then turn back around north, the direction we came from, for 4 to 5 miles, and then turn around again and go back to the airport, our TOD would have been just fine. But of course, we weren't going to fly those extra 8 or 9 miles, so we were now ridiculously high. We pulled the thrust lever to idle, cranked in a descent rate of at least 3,000 feet per minute, and waited to see if that would get us down in time. Now, it looked like we were going to need a 360 to get down, but just about then we got lucky, and Bakersfield switched the runway, so we were now going to be landing on runway 30 right, which meant we'd be flying 4 to 5 miles south of the field, which was almost exactly the extra distance that had been in our flight plan. So we were able to descend in time, but I took away a very valuable lesson I won't forget, which is when you're relying on the calculated TOD points, top of descent, to decide when to descend, make sure the flight plan reflects your true path to the airport and that it doesn't have any extra legs that make the distance to the airport artificially longer, as if it does, you will end up too high. And here's one other tip for flying a visual approach. If possible, back up your approach by loading the ILS if there's one available for the runway you'll be landing on. That's standard procedure for the airlines, and when flying the visual at a large airport, ATC may give you instructions to maintain a certain speed until you reach a particular fix on the ILS approach. And if you don't have that approach loaded, you're going to be scrambling to find it at the last minute, which isn't fun. Another big gotcha I see with pilots transitioning into jets is that some of them stop listening to the ATIS after they hear the altimeter setting. They're not listening all the way to the end of the ATIS to hear which runways are being used for landing and departures and which instrument approaches are in use. For example, it's pretty silly to ask for the ILS when the ATIS says that the glide slope is out of service. And knowing which runway they're using for landings will be very helpful in choosing which approach to request. So listen to the full ATIS all the way to the end. Another big problem I see is that people sometimes don't slow down before joining the instrument approach. Yes, you can fly at 250 knots when below 10,000 feet, but you're going to have one heck of a large turn radius if you don't slow well below that speed while on a base leg vector to join the final approach course. I like having the track vector set for 1 minute so that I can quickly estimate how many minutes away I am from being turned on to the approach. Sometimes when I ask pilots how many minutes it will be before we join the approach, they'll sometimes say something like, 5 or 6 minutes, when we're actually just a minute or two away. And that's about the latest time you want to start slowing up for your turn onto the final approach course, unless, of course, ATC has assigned you a particular speed to maintain. Another problem I've seen with pilots is when there are multiple approaches of the same type to the same runway. For example, at Van Nuys Airport, there's both an ILS Yankee 16 right and an ILS Zulu to 16 right. And I've had pilots say, I'm going to choose the ILS Zulu approach because it has the lower minimums. And that's all the further thought they gave to the decision. People, when there are 2 ILSs to the same runway or 2 GPS approaches to the same runway, there's a reason for that, and it's up to you to figure out the reason. To be successful flying IFR, you need some intellectual curiosity. You need to be thinking, I wonder why there are 2 nearly identical approaches to the runway, but with different minimums. If you just simply choose the one with the lower minimums, you have no idea whether you and your plane can meet the requirements for those lower minimums without doing a little bit of homework. Often these approaches are to airports with hills or mountains behind the airport. Now, does that give you a little clue? If not, think about the missed approach. Does it take you over those hills? If it does, maybe the climb out on the missed approach exceeds the standard 200 feet per nautical mile gradient that the entire instrument system is predicated upon. If it does, then you can expect there will be 2 versions of an approach. One approach, usually the Yankee approach, will have higher minimums for the approach, but will have the standard 200 feet per nautical mile climb requirement for the missed approach, while the one with lower minimums, typically the Zulu approach, may have 200-foot minimums, but if you fly the missed, in order to not plow into the mountain, you need to be able to do a climb rate that's higher than the standard 200-foot per nautical mile climb rate. And if you just pick the approach with the lower minimums and you don't give it any further thought, you may be setting yourself up for a crash if you have to go missed. Also, as you're getting close to your destination, listen to what's going on at the airport and build a mental map of what's going on. Just in the last couple of weeks, I've had 2 separate Vision Jet go-arounds where I anticipated that we might have to go around and where the pilots were caught by surprise when we had to go around. In one case, while listening to the tower frequency, I heard that there had been a bird strike on the runway and that an airport ops truck had been sent out to remove the bird. If you're on final when that happens, you ought to be thinking, hey, if they're slow getting that bird off the runway, I may have to go around. So be prepared and think about the steps you'll need to follow. In another case, we were flying IFR in a jet into Hayward, California, and the tower turned to 172 onto base in front of us. Immediately, I anticipated we might have to go around, and when the tower did call for a go-around, they were partially blocked by someone else transmitting, but I'd been anticipating the call, so I knew they were calling us and I knew what they were saying, even though we could only hear part of the transmission. And while I acknowledged that we were going around, at the same time I said that we were canceling IFR. Why? Because if we hadn't canceled IFR, they might have shipped us back to NorCal approach, and we would have spent another 10-plus minutes getting vectored back around onto the approach at low altitude, where the jets gulp lots of fuel. Instead, the tower acknowledged our IFR cancellation, assigned us left traffic, and we were able to land much more quickly. Another thing I see frequently is pilots not choosing an FBO ahead of time. And when they arrive and tower or ground ask where they'd like to go, they're unsure. By contrast, the savvy pilots have figured this out ahead of time, often while we're in cruise. And they also look at the airport layout diagram ahead of time to see where the FBO they've chosen is located on the field. That way, when they're landing on the runway, they already know whether they want to turn left or turn right when they exit the runway. If you don't plan ahead of time, you may exit to the right only to discover that the FBO was on the left, and now ATC has to send you back across the runway to the other side of the field. So plan ahead. And finally, another big item is to use your checklist. Just in the last couple of weeks, I've had 2 pilots shut off a piston engine incorrectly. One turned the mag key off, which immediately kills the engine, but potentially leaves some unburned fuel in the engine, which under some circumstances could cause a hot prop to fire when it's moved. The other pilot pulled the mixture but left the boost pump on so the engine didn't stop. In one case, the pilot had a couple of 100 hours, and in the other case, about 500 hours. In neither case were they using their checklists. The first pilot said that he was distracted since he was already thinking about having to drive back to work after our flight. The second pilot had been flying a lot almost every day and had started becoming a little complacent, feeling like he now knew his airplane fairly well and didn't need to use the checklist. And there's a fallacy in that thinking. Just because we gain more experience as pilots, it doesn't mean that we can now skip the procedures we were taught to use when we were less experienced. Those same procedures apply to all pilots, regardless of how much time they have. So act professionally and use a checklist all the time, even when you start to feel a little cocky about just how good a pilot you've become. Well, I hope you found this list helpful and that it helps you fly more professionally. And if you have any other items that you think we should add to this list, please send me an audio recording to aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. And you can just use the Voice Memos app on your smartphone to do that, or head on out to aviationnewstalk.com on the web. If you've got a microphone on your computer, just click on the top of the page on Listener Questions. It doesn't have to be a listener question. It could be any type of audio feedback that you want to send us, up to 90 seconds. That'll use the SpeakPipe app, and that'll send the file over to me. And if you want to send me an email, go to the same place, aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. And I want to thank everyone who contributes to the show in whatever way you do, whether it's sending us audio feedback and email feedback, telling your friends about the show, giving us a review on the app that you're listening to tell folks how great you think the show is, and of course for those who support the show financially at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome on Patreon or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.